Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a great day's conversation, and lots of what I'm going to say has been mirrored by other speakers who've expressed it better than myself. I think journalists are very bad people to go to when you've got a really big event going on. We look at the minutiae of things, and we sometimes miss the really, really big events. But I think we're going through an extremely big event right now in Europe, in the West, in relation to Russia and America. And in a sense, the playground is the Middle East. But the root causes of it are not necessarily Middle Eastern. I think we're going through a change, a sort of delayed action change which has been sparked by the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I witnessed as a journalist in Moscow in the 1990s. I think some profound things are changing, particularly about Western behavior, when I see how Western advisors acted to Yeltsin and what is happening now and how Russia's response to that became. I'll start with Europe, because I speak as a European. My parents came from Vienna. They were refugees from the 30s. They fought with the Allied side in the British Army. They stopped speaking German. They became British. For them, Europe was an end of war. It was the end of conflict. Europe, particularly Britain, became the sort of hub of decency, tolerance, integration. They were more than happy to lose all their Viennese roots and become totally British. And now, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that Europe no longer behaves in this way. It's completely lost that image of a safe haven. It isn't the end of conflict. It's an incubator of conflict in some cases. I'm thinking very much of the role that EU negotiators played in setting a light or setting a match to a conflict that had been simmering for some time, and I'd actually covered Ukraine. I cannot think of anything more cack-handed than the effect of what they did, and I'm not taking the blame from Russia or indeed eastern Ukraine, but anyone seeing that revolution knew that one effect in Kiev on those days would know that one part of the East would split away from it. And if you wanted to avoid that split, then you wouldn't have been behaving in the same way that certain forces did in Kiev at that time. But it's not just Ukraine, and it's not just Eastern Europe. There are splits emerging, very, very nasty splits emerging between so-called New Europe and Old Europe. And real social passions are being stirred by internal migration across the EU. And I can't believe some of the things that I'm hearing from my Polish friends, for instance, in Britain. But some people who were the sons and daughters of the Poles formed Spitfire fighter squadrons during the Battle of Britain. Their sons and daughters are now hearing comments like, when they complain about the weather, they say, why don't you go back home? And these are people who have settled in Britain as British as I. It's unbelievable, some of the xenophobia that's going on, all as a result of the Brexit vote. There's an unease in Europe that goes to the very heart of safe, liberal Europe, Denmark, for instance, where there are a whole series of parties that are sort of outmaneuvering themselves on the right. And in France, the mood is as ugly, if not uglier. And as we've heard, Marine Le Pen will achieve something her father did in 2002 by going to the second round, we think, in the presidential elections next year. So we're not talking about fringe protests, we're talking about a real political insurgency. And one of the effects of this, I think, or one of the signs of it, is that the social democratic elites of the left and of the right have lost their representative capacity. This is a Europe that's building walls, it's reversing Schengen, and it's jettisoning its liberal values to reassert its sovereignty. And the biggest and clearest example of that is the use of the French word laïcité. The law that governed that was, I think, in 1906, and it was a liberal law, and it was entirely about pushing away the power of the Catholic Church. It is now being used as a stick of the far right and also of the centre-right to reassert what Frenchman means by being in the French Republic. And it's almost entirely used against French Muslims. They say it's being used against French Islamists, but it's actually being used against everyone, Algerians, everyone. And the irony of that is that Europe is a very secular place. Churches are half empty. The Catholic Church in Ireland has real problems recruiting priests. But Christian Europe feels under threat. And so Europe is less of a union than more of a state of emergency at the moment. As far as America is concerned, and America, so my argument is that Europe is in no shape to project any values or to its neighborhood. In America, there are similar, I think, when it comes to the Middle East, similar problems. I have real difficulty analysing or even describing American policy with various countries in the Middle East. In many conflicts, they appear to be on two sides at the same time. Middle East Eye published a whole series of articles based on the tapes of air traffic control in MENA airport, which is in Benghazi, a Haftar-controlled airport. And it emerged that there were American, British, Emirati, Jordanian air traffic controllers and special forces helping Haftar basically bomb his enemies in another part of Benghazi. While at the same time, the same forces, or different parts of the same special forces, were helping the Misratan brigades try to recapture Sirte. One side was fighting against Tripoli, the other side was fighting against IS. America was on both sides at the same time. There are similar problems of deconfliction in northern Syria, and a real problem for America as to who they liberate al-Bab with. Is it with the YPG or is it with Turkish forces? On Israel, for instance, Obama's head, and presumably also Hillary's too, is held in an arm lock by Netanyahu. Days after getting the biggest military aid deal from Washington it's ever got, Israel announced another settlement in the West Bank, and Obama cried, "Is this how you treat a friend?" No, but it is how you treat the weak. And Netanyahu correctly calculates that no US president would dare penalize Israel, as Bush Sr. once did, or tried to do. And Netanyahu correctly weighs the power of his argument in Washington. The more unstable the region gets, the more the US has to depend on Israel. Israel, thus, has a strategic interest in regional instability. On Syria, where does America stand? Which America? Is it the State Department? Is it the Pentagon? Or is it even Kerry? Which John Kerry are we talking about? Is it the Kerry who told Syrian aid workers at a private meeting in London that the Syrian opposition was responsible for the collapse of the peace talks in Geneva in February? Or is it the Kerry who told another private group of Syrians in New York that his diplomacy had not been backed by the use of force? He was one of 4 people in the administration who lost the argument about using US force against Assad in Syria. 2 private conversations say exactly the opposite from the same person to roughly the same group of people. What about America's relations with Turkey and the whole coup? In the run-up to July the 15th, there was a steady stream of briefings emanating from very senior Western intelligence sources MI6, CIA, and also in Germany, that Erdogan was arming and trading oil with the IS. The same briefings are now coming out through Gulenist sources. In January, we published another article, which was a private briefing that King Abdullah of Jordan gave senior members of the US Congress, in which he said that Erdogan was a regional ideological threat. A few months before that, Seymour Hersh, a veteran investigative reporter, quoted an unnamed advisor of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a story about how the Pentagon had undermined the White House's policy to Assad. And the killer sentence in this was, if these weren't made up, and I don't think these quotes were made up, we worked with the Turks we trusted who were not loyal to Erdogan and got them to ship to the jihadists in Syria all the obsolete weapons in the arsenal, including M1 carbines that hadn't been seen since the Korean War and lots of Soviet arms. It was a message Assad could understand. We have the power to diminish a presidential policy in its tracks. So what's happening here? Why are the lever? Why are separate American departments fighting against each other? Why are they undermining each other? Why is Kerry saying different things to different people? What is this mess about? I think there are two basic sort of assumptions that are crumbling, and they are sort of intellectual assumptions. And they're the assumptions that I witnessed at first hand when I was a reporter in Moscow in the 1990s. And the reason why it seems so obvious to me is because in the 1990s, the West, and particularly American advisors to Yeltsin, were so full of confidence. They believed Russia had crumbled and they could remake a new Russia in their own image. It was like playing with soft wax. Everything had crumbled, everything was new. And this was a time for evangelists, this was a time for advisors, this was a time for carpetbaggers, this was a time for all sorts of people buying up whole tracts of land they didn't actually end up owning. It was a Klondike. The first assumption that they had was neoliberalism, the theory that markets are paramount and that global capital overrides national borders. The second was neoconservatism, which in foreign affairs is the belief in the power of intervention. It's actually quite a revolutionary idea. It's the idea, as Stan McChrystal once put it, you can unpack democracy from the back of a Chinook. Unlike neoliberalism, which has close ties to classical liberalism, neoconservatism is revolutionary. It destroys institutions like the UN, it rejects the rule of law, it advocates US exceptionalism. It's utopian. It's a rejection of the conservatism of Burke or Oakeshott. And both of these pillars, I believe, are crumbling. One crumbled with the banking crash, and it's really interesting now to see a British Prime Minister, British Conservative Prime Minister, take on the likes of Nissan in Sunderland and Goldman Sachs in London, both of whom are threatening to ship out large quantities of workers after Brexit. Theresa May said that to be a citizen of the world is to be a citizen of nowhere, and that the nation state is now a device to protect the weak. Nation states are there to look after those who are not rich and powerful. This is a speech that could have been said, this was said last week, but it could have been said by a French socialist prime minister any time in the last decade. But it's now being said by the country that adopted absolutely in full the so-called Anglo-Saxon ultra-liberal approach. And you can see the wreckage of neoconservatism in the interventions all the way around the Middle East. Now, this is not so much a vacuum into which regional powers are entering. It's almost as if the intervention franchise has been bought by regional powers. And Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Turkey and Qatar are all taking their own foreign policy, sometimes as allies and sometimes as directly against each other, depending on the arena. In Libya, there's Jordan and the Emirates and Egypt fighting basically against forces which are backed by Turkey and Qatar. In Yemen, there is an even more complicated confusion going on. To be an ally of the US is to be the recipient of regular shocks. In the reign of King Abdullah, it was Washington's readiness to ditch Mubarak that really shocked the kingdom and pitted them on this. They ignored the Iranian threat and pitted them on this fight against the Brotherhood and Islam in all its manifestations. In the reign of King Salman, it's the 9/11 bill that's going through Congress, which is causing a huge shock. The lesson is that the US is an unreliable ally, or at least an ally that needs itself to be led, and that Riyadh itself must be becoming active. That's why I think the absence of America isn't just absence, it's being absent without leave. Like, in a real sense, America is going AWOL. So what that leaves us with is a series of sub-interventions that take their own course. I think there's a real loss of control about what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. And in one way, I would compare it to the fact that Saudi Arabia invited America in to Iraq in 2003. And the American and the British invasion set up its own dynamic and ultimately triggered a civil war. In the same way, Iran invited Russia in to Syria, and Putin is behaving in Aleppo very much in the same way as he did in Grozny. This is not necessarily in Iran's interests. I think what we were getting to is a nexus of weakness. There's a weak America, a weak Russia. I think Putin, we've heard how he learnt from the Libyan crisis. And I remember a film that was produced by the FSB, which was a huge attack on Medvedev. And one of the things that was said in the film in Russian was that he's destroying our arms markets. Well, Putin is rebuilding his arms markets, or think he is doing so in Aleppo. He's saying, look how effectively Russian arms work. This is not the Soviet Union. This is not the restoration of a big Russia, but it is the response to a Russia that felt let down by the West and acted in very much the same way, had very much the same experience as many Arab countries have about the West. And we have a leaderless Europeans. Where this is going to lead, I've absolutely no idea, but I think, to go back to what I was saying right at the beginning, that this is a massive change that is taking place, and it will take possibly decades to realize and to have a new shape. And in the meantime, we are long away from a 1945 moment when peace starts simply through either victory or mutual exhaustion. I think there's a lot more fighting to come. Thank you.